Hi, I'm Richard Dennis, Chief Economist at the Australia Institute.
I'm Matt Grudnoff. I'm the Senior Economist, coming to you from isolation, and welcome to Ask an Economist. Our question today is, what is Casey Briggs talking about when he says, I'm beginning to think a lot of people commenting on the details of the National Cabinet Agreed Pandemic Transition Plan haven't read the National Cabinet Agreed Transition Plan. What's he talking about here, Richard?
Well, I think that's a pretty good guess. So the National Transition Plan is based on the Doherty modelling. And a lot of people have probably heard a lot about the Doherty modelling. So
wait a minute, Richard, what's modelling to begin with? Is this where, all of them come down and the catwalk and look good?
This is me modelling now, Matt. Here's blue steel. So a model, whether it's an economic model or an epidemiological model or even a climate model, is an attempt to use the information we have, the data we have, to build a statistical framework, a statistical picture of the way we think the world works. So a mathematical model of the economy or of COVID isn't a description of reality. It's not like if you build a model car, you can't drive your kids somewhere in it. Well, building a model of the economy or a model of how COVID spreads isn't a life-size depiction of the world in all of its complexity. But if you think about a model car, the wheels are where you'd expect the wheels to be. The steering wheel's where you'd expect the steering wheel to be.
If you bought a model car, you wouldn't expect to get a submarine or a boat.
Correct. And when you look at a model car, it resembles a real car. It can help you understand a real car. And if you think about, before they take a plane takes off with passengers, they flight test, in experiments, they get models and think, is this going to fly, before they ever stick a pilot or a passenger in it. So building a model is a way to help understand reality. But this is really important. The model isn't reality. The model's an attempt to understand key relationships between things that do happen in reality. So the Doherty modelling that we've heard so much about is an attempt to say, well, how fast do we think COVID's going to spread through our community? And there's lots of moving parts in the COVID model, but the really important parts, the bits that really drive the results, are the percentage of people who are vaccinated, the effectiveness of social distancing and washing our hands and those sort of things, and the effectiveness of what's called testing, tracing, isolation, and quarantine. So to recap, how do we predict how fast the virus will spread? Well, we need information about the virus itself. We need information about how many people are vaccinated. We need information about social distancing measures like washing our hands or lockdowns or are schools open or not. And we need to know about testing, tracing, isolation, and quarantine. Now,
if you've just been listening to the commentary, you'd think that all the model really looks about is vaccination rates, because that's all they seem to talk about. Is it at 70%? Is it at 80%? So you're saying that there is a lot more in it than just how many people have been vaccinated.
Absolutely. So if you think about something like, if we had a model of how much fuel a car uses, one answer is, part of the answer was, how does the engine work? Is it an efficient engine or isn't it? But there's all sorts of other parts of the answer, like, are you towing a caravan, or have you got a boot full of concrete? So yes, we're talking a lot about vaccination rates in the Doherty modelling, but it's not just a simplification. It's dangerous to think that the Doherty modelling is only concerned with vaccination. So what we've got here is the Doherty modelling that you've heard a lot about. In these results here, we're looking at how rapidly the cases will grow if we open up when we only have what's called partially effective TTIQ. Now, if there's 50% vaccination coverage, then after 90 days, we're going to get to 100,000 cases per day. according to the Doherty modelling. Now, obviously, the faster we can vaccinate, the better. There's no debate about that. We need to vaccinate as quickly as we can. And if we get to 80% vaccination coverage with partially effective TTIQ, then the Doherty modelling suggests we might only have 40,000 cases a day in Australia. 40,000 cases a day. So when we talk about opening up safely, at the moment with 80% vaccination coverage, if TTIQ, testing, tracing, isolation and quarantine, is only partially effective, then we're only looking at 40,000 cases a day. Sure, it takes 6 months, not 3 months to get to, but still there's an enormous risk to Australians if we open up at 80% vaccination if TTIQ is only partially effective. Now, to give you some understanding of how important fully effective TTIQ is, let me just show you the next slide from the Doherty modelling. And what it says is that if we have optimal TTIQ, that is, we're really good, we're really fast at identifying who has got COVID and getting them into isolation really quickly, then rather than heading for something like 100,000 cases a day with 50% vaccination, then we're more likely to look at something like 4,000 or 6,000 cases a day. Now that's a lot, but it's far less than I just showed you. And if we open up at 80% vaccination coverage with optimal TTIQ, then according to Doherty, we're more likely to have 50 cases a day. Not 50,000, 50 cases a day. That's how important the difference is between this optimal TTIQ and the partially effective TTIQ. Now, what's happening in New South Wales at the moment suggests that TTIQ isn't optimal or partial. It's actually almost vanished completely. But just one last bit of evidence from the Doherty's modelling, which really I think makes this point very clearly. If according to the Doherty modelling you had to choose between having 50% vaccination coverage with optimal testing, tracing, isolation and quarantine, or 70% vaccine coverage with partial testing, tracing, isolation and quarantine, then you're going to get a lot less deaths when you've got optimal TTIQ, according to Doherty, maybe 5 deaths a day, compared to more like 50 deaths a day if we let our testing, tracing and isolation quarantine system break down. So what we really need to pay attention to is how to vaccinate as many people as fast as we can, but we also have to make sure we keep case numbers low enough that we can have testing, tracing, isolation and quarantine working well. Because here's the best graph. If we get high vaccination coverage and we retain our TTIQ, look, there's almost no deaths. And obviously that's what Australia should be aiming for. This TTIQ system is literally the only reason that for the last 18 months, most Australians have been walking around wondering what happened in New York and wondering what happened in London. And before we criticise New York and London, understand that by the time in New York they figured out they had a problem, there were thousands of people infected. And when you've already got thousands, you can't go and find everyone they spoke to quick enough to stop them passing it on to someone else. So back to the modelling, in the Doherty modelling, the assumption is that testing, tracing, isolation and quarantine is one of the most powerful forces that we have to suppress the virus. That's in the Doherty modelling. And to give you an example of how powerful it is, the people at Doherty think that the ability of TTIQ to keep COVID under control is equivalent to vaccinating around 60% of Australians.
60% of Australia. So it's more important right now than even our current vaccination rate.
Today, TTIQ is doing more to suppress the virus than our vaccination to date. So we've all heard how important the contact tracers are. It wasn't until I read the Doherty modelling that I thought, wow, they literally saved Australia last year. But now here's the problem, or here's one of the problems with the Doherty modelling. The Doherty modelling assumes it's okay to make assumptions, but when a model makes an assumption, you can't then use it in situations where the assumption is a bit silly. So when the modelling was done in June, the people at Doherty assumed that our ability to test, trace, isolate, and quarantine would never be as stretched, would never perform as poorly as it did during Melbourne's second wave when there were 700 cases. So they weren't having a go at Melbourne. They were saying, wow, when there's 700 cases.
In a single day. So there are more than 700 cases in Victoria overall, but like we've got up to about 700 and something cases in a single day.
That's right. And for TTIQ to work, because this disease spreads so fast, if it takes you a week to find the people that I spent my day with, there's kind of no point doing it. So according to the Doherty modelling, they kind of calibrated the effectiveness of TTIQ, testing, tracing, isolate, quarantine, on how well the Melbourneians were doing when there was more than 700 new cases a day.
But wait a minute, Richard, wait a minute. So in Sydney at the moment, we've already passed over 700 cases a day. In fact, we've got above 1,000 cases a day, and it doesn't look like it's slowing down yet.
No, and it's worse than that. Last Thursday, when New South Wales reported 1,000 cases, 800 of those cases were mystery cases. Okay, so 80% in New South Wales are mystery cases. Now, what's this got to do with the modelling? What's this got to do with Scott Morrison? What's this got to do with 70, 80%? It's got everything to do with it. Because in the Doherty modelling, they assume that the ability to test and trace and isolate and quarantine it remains good. It remains pretty good. It remains as good as it was in Melbourne last year, but in New South Wales, it's way past that. Now,
so you're saying their assumption was a good one before the Sydney outbreak, but now that we've had the Sydney outbreak, that assumption might be making the model less able to predict what's going to happen.
Exactly, and in fact, it's far worse than that, because basically what's already happening in New South Wales is the TTIQ system is effectively breaking down under pressure. Now, when you hear the Prime Minister say, the people at Doherty assure him that it doesn't matter how many initial cases there are when we open up, when the Prime Minister says the modelling isn't sensitive to the number of initial cases, the modelling doesn't radically change whether you start with 0 cases or 30 cases or 1,000 cases, the Prime Minister is right to describe that that's what the modelling says. But that's not how the world works. The world works, unfortunately, that as the number of cases rise, the effectiveness of our TTIQ declines. And this is really important. We've got a model that assumes the ability of our testing and tracing is constant, regardless of how many cases there were. And that was probably true. It probably was constant when you went from 0 to 10 or 10 to 100, maybe 100 to 200. But it's obvious that once you get to a certain point, the more cases you have, the less effective our tracing and quarantine is.
Because the traces simply can't keep up with all the new cases that are coming up.
Overwhelmed. So I'm not being critical of the traces here. I'm saying it's like, you know, you've got firefighters doing a pretty good job with their hose keeping a fire under control. If you double the size of the fire and you don't double the number of trained firemen and women, then guess what? It gets out of control. So unfortunately, what we're seeing at the moment is a political discussion about, it doesn't matter whether you open up at 30 cases or 1,000 cases. The modelling says, well, I know what the modelling says. The modelling says if the effectiveness of our tracing is constant, then we can keep on top of it. But we can see that the effectiveness of our tracing regime is already in free fall. And this is very bad for what's happening in New South Wales. And the significance of this is Victoria, Queensland, the ACT, South Australia, who've got their tracing pretty much under control at the moment, if they were to open up to New South Wales today, then their tracing system would be overwhelmed as well. And of course, the Doherty modelling assumes their tracing system will never be overwhelmed.
And that it's a really, really important part of the system.
Really one of, if not the most important part. Now, what's the best way to overwhelm Queensland's tracing system? Let 1,000 people with New South Wales go into it. What's the best way to overwhelm the South Australian system or the Victorian system? Open up the borders. So the modelling literally assumes that we will always have at least pretty good tracing, but we're using modelling that assumes we'll always have pretty good tracing to justify opening up borders that would destroy the effectiveness of tracing. So yeah, when you hear people say the modelling says when you get to 80%, we can open up and that's that. Well, the modelling is more complicated than that. It's got more moving parts than that. Be crystal clear, we need to get people vaccinated. Please, if you're not vaccinated yet and your doctor says you should be, get yourself vaccinated. I'm glad the Prime Minister says we should all get vaccinated as fast as we can. I wish he had said that 6 months ago.
And had vaccines to do it.
And had the vaccines to do it. So yes, we need to get vaccinated. And yes, the sooner we can vaccinate a lot of the population, the better. But, and yes, we can't open up until there's a high degree of vaccination, but we also can't open up until we've restored a really effective testing and tracing regime. And the only way to do that is to push the numbers back down, because New South Wales aren't going to get on top of their testing and tracing until they get cases back down in the 1 to 200 range. So that's what New South Wales still has to do. And the idea that the rest of the country opens up before New South Wales can even tell us which cities and towns in New South Wales have got the outbreaks, it's dangerous. And to be clear, it's not what the modelling actually suggests.